Hello, hello. Welcome to Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor, Joe Sparrow. And in this episode, we're extremely happy to welcome Jamie Oborne, founder of All on Red and of Dirty Hit, and probably best known amongst all that as the manager of the 1975, to talk about the future of management, the role, the responsibilities, and the business functions that managers of artists will be taking on in coming years. It's a really great conversation, actually. And it was great to get onto the podcast a manager who has worked with an artist from the very beginning and taken them to global headline success. Jamie told us all sorts of interesting things about how he'd done it, the way he tried to deliberately operate differently to all the deals and the systems that he'd experienced as an artist and as an early manager, and how that then ties in very, very closely to the way that artists such as the 1975 and the other artists on his label and roster operate. We talked about how the role of manager has changed in the last decade or so and what a manager needs to do today that they might not have needed to do previously. We also talk about that stickiest of questions for managers, which is, in an era where you can do everything as manager, how do you choose what not to do? And for the first time, a manager has actually given me a really clear and satisfying answer on that. It's a really fascinating conversation. He has really great insight on the nature of artistic collaboration, the nature of artistry, and the nature of management when it comes to artists that really cut through at a personal and global level. Let's go over to that interview right now. So I'm very happy to welcome Jamie Oborne, founder of All on Red and Dirty Hit, to the podcast. Hello, Jamie.
Hi, nice to meet you.
And glad to have you here. Now, before we talk about the future of management and what you've experienced in it, can you give us a little bit of initial context, just for the listeners, who you are, what you do, but how you got there, really?
Yeah, of course. I had a management company and a record label, both independent. I started managing approaching 20 years ago. My management company, or my management career, I guess, was born out of, I was initially a musician myself, and when that kind of imploded, I knew I wanted to work in music, but I knew that I didn't want to perform any longer. So, it was very much like my thought process was, well, being a manager is like the second best job in the world to the best being an artist. And really, it was born out of a conversation with a friend of mine who was asking me about why I felt my musical career had floundered. And I was explaining to him that we were managed by quite a big management company who had a lot of artists. They were very successful, but their approach seemed to be they would take on a lot of artists and they would just wait and see which artist connected, or which artists started getting traction, and then they would put their resource and effort behind that artist. And I felt like perhaps looking back, I needed a bit more kind of a nurturing relationship than that,
Mm-hmm.
So that was really the kind of principle on which the management company was formed. And I did that for a number of years. I had various artists signed to various record labels. And I quickly became quite frustrated with my perceived loss of control once said artist did a deal with said label. And at that time, there was very much a culture of how, as a manager, like how we would get attention on an artist was, we'd put out like a 7/8 and hype it up and, do the initial stages of like, a marketing campaign, I guess. And I quite quickly realized that I really liked that process and got a lot out of it. I liked feeling like I was able to protect and really execute an artist's vision. And then at the same time, I had a couple of artists that nobody wanted to sign. One of them who went on to be the 1975, and another who I still work with both, called Benjamin Francis Lethwich, who was actually our first ever release on Dirty Hit and was somewhat of a success and gave me the initial sort of cash flow, I guess, that I needed to actually really make the label into something real, because at the beginning, of course, like all of these things, it was an idea and it was like a set of principles. It wasn't a reality. It was like a hope or a wish.
And that has sort of been the hallmark of what you've done, which is this very holistic way of working, isn't it? Where you've worked very closely with the artists. Let's separate it here in a management sense. And then you've been able to execute that vision with the sort of similar clarity through the label side. And obviously, that's a very, very important setup for you in terms of the way you do things. And you mentioned there, of course, the 1975, who are an enormous global success and have benefited from this approach. So when you look back now over that period, and from this fairly unique perspective of how you work, how has that role of manager changed in that time? Perhaps whether that's your role or the roles you see around you as well.
That's a really amazing question, actually. I think there's a lot of talk, isn't there, these days of how a manager's role has changed and how a manager is expected to be able to wear a number of hats and wear them well and, be the sort of architect of everything with the artist. And how the modern music industry, like, almost demands that to an extent. But for me, it was like, I don't know. I felt like, I sort of stumbled across that realization quite a long time ago, and it was based in, of course, it was based in like a desire to have like a more holistic approach and be able to support artists better and protect their vision and, properly run a campaign and make records that were uncompromising. But also, well, I started when the music industry was at its lowest ebb,
Yeah.
And I remember actually, because I would often, in my day-to-day life, mention that I wanted to, you know, have a record label. And people genuinely used to look at me like I was crazy because it was, it was it was the absolute bottom of the market, really. Like, couldn't have actually got anywhere. It was the business had been absolutely decimated by illegal downloads. And actually, it was really a shift in culture. What I mean by that, it was like a shift in how we consume. It was like the birth of like the digital age, really. I mean, it was a little bit like the Wild West. I mean, it still is, honestly. But there's slightly more rules now, or rather, the rules are slightly more enforced. So I think for me, like, the industry was always in a state of flux, and my lack of position within it and the principles that I wanted to kind of incorporate into the artist careers that I worked on, like, it kind of demanded that approach, really, because I wanted everything to be very controlled. I wanted it to be done kind of like our way, as in mine and the artist. And I had felt compromised before when I had entered into recording contracts with different labels. So I think I was quite fortunate in that my lack of experience and my lack of foothold in the industry sort of made me have to create something in order to occupy a space. And also, most importantly, so I was very lucky in the sense that, well, I've been very lucky throughout my career, but I had an artist signed to a label called Infectious Records, who was called a Marshall label. One day he pointed out to me that no one really understood the value of digital copyright. And that was really, like, I'd started putting out records before then. Like I said, we used to do it as managers to hype up an artist or to do a deal. So I'd had some experience. I knew I loved being in control and protecting the art vision. We've already established that. It really lit a fire in me that made me feel like I was slightly ahead of the curve.
Right.
And no, I've always remained very, very grateful for that. And I'm sure, like, some of your listeners probably heard me say that before. I'm bored of me saying it, but it was a really important point in my career because I was thinking of doing it and I needed someone to sort of push me over the edge. And I feel like, without even realizing, he like, Corda did that, and he loves it when I say that.
But yeah, he'll claim his 10% sometime soon, I'm sure. Now, what you've mentioned there is that idea of control. which is, you can see through history numerous examples across lots of different forms of art where control is retained and great art comes out. And, let's talk about the 1975 again, one of the most distinctive bands on the planet with an incredibly clear vision that's communicated really clearly. And that's a big part of their success and how people connect to it. And if you cascade that sort of idea of control down a bit, artists today, whether they're DIY or even arena level, they are aiming to create this business model that is about control in a sense, in so much as direct to fan. They want to control that direct connection with their audience. They want to bypass intermediaries, which is what you've just talked about in terms of the frustrations you felt with labels. And they're able to see now how technology is providing this, numerous opportunities to monetize that connection in a way that feels great for the artist and great for the fan, right? And that is kind of what you're doing here. So that's something which I know our audience is really interested in. So what have you learned about this, having started essentially that quite early in the digital age?
Yeah.
And that direct to fan thing. And how key is this to the future of management?
Well, I think what you're describing is like community building, like fan base building. And I'd be lying if I said I knew, the secret of doing that. Well, actually, I do know the secret of doing it. The secret of doing it is great art. What I think sometimes the challenges we all face is it's difficult to know why we connect with what we connect with, or why an audience connects with what they connect with. Do you know what I mean? The only thing I have to base it on, and it always sounds like terribly like esoteric whenever I do these type of things, which is not very often. And it feels like I'm talking about, magic or something. But I guess in a way it is, because I don't really know why some people forge easy connections and others don't. But I certainly know I certainly can feel when an artist is, I know when that is present and when it's not. Do you know what I mean? That thing. And many artists do it in many different ways, I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with, one of the artists who have always had Matthew's always had a very natural understanding of fandom and has always been slightly, I think, culturally ahead of his time. And sometimes that has been his undoing, honestly. And other times it's been, testament to his great success, But I don't, I reckon maybe it's easy to say I recognize the absence of it more than identifying the embryo of it, if that makes sense. Because I think, if I knew how to do that, I would have it with every artist I ever work with.
Yeah.
And frankly, I don't. And when it does happen, it's a really special and it's a really special and like I don't know, like it's a really sought after thing, isn't it? It's really precious. It's funny actually. When I started working with Bleachers and Jack, I went to a show before we were working together. I went to a show of his in London. That feeling was sort of palpable, and it was kind of funny. It highlights what we're talking about quite well. Afterwards, I went there to, wasn't working with him at the time. Went there to support my friend. Afterwards, I went backstage to say hi. He's like, "What did you think?" I was like, "Why?" All I can remember saying was, "Why is no one marketing that?" But I just thought that it just felt crazy that it was that even I, someone who worked in music, like didn't know what was happening with that band. So
it's a big part of it. And what you've described there really is artistry, the sort of true artistry, and that, and it is magic, that creative impulse that is essentially the most human thing. And people do connect to that. You've identified this artistry, it's something special, and then you've got to connect it to fans. And ultimately, fans do react to that, and then they form this beautiful relationship. But this is the million-dollar question, I guess. How do you do that in terms of identifying the magic part and then communicate it in a way that reaches the right people who are going to go head over heels for it?
Yeah. And again, without meaning to sound too kind of simplistic, like myself and the team at Dirty Hit, principally Ed actually, Ed Blow, who's sort of my right hand man at Dirty Hit. I guess we just make we help the artists make things like on a marketing level that we just think cool, and
Yeah.
I think we have, above average taste, and, we both are obsessed with, pop culture and music part within that. And we really just chase down making kind of the coolest stuff that we possibly can that the artist also wants to make. And, often it's their ideas, honestly. We just help execute them. And I always say like the best marketing campaigns have really strictly defined rules, like visual rules, communicative rules. And it's funny because when I first say that, I sometimes see people frown, but when they think about it and they look at what that actually means, it's so true. Like the artists that I think really thrive and find those audiences are the ones who have the strongest sense of identity and know what they want. And often I feel that there's two types of artists. And again, I've said this before so many times. So sorry if anyone finds it boring, but there's there's two types of artists. There's like artists that kind of want to do it, and then artists that have to do it. And the latter is always the most powerful because it's like an innate sort of need in their soul rather than just a desire.
Yeah.
That's what I found.
Clearly, there's this key role in how you manage, and actually, you hear this from successful managers in lots of different parts of life and jobs, where they say, well, actually, my role is to sort of facilitate the people I work with and free them to do the things they're really good at.
Exactly that.
And again, going back to it sort of comes back to that idea of what a manager does or can do. Because obviously now in 2024, and you've proven this as an independent entity, you can sit with your team and say, right, what should we do? We have all the platforms available. We can do pretty much literally everything ourselves. It's about making decisions that enable what you've just described, which is right. We know the vision, we know the art, we know sort of the audience. Now let's join the dots and we can do that ourselves. This is a question I've asked some managers before. Some of them find it difficult to put their finger on, but how do you choose what not to do? Because you've got everything available.
We have this great rule that if anything we do makes any one of us cringe, then it's dead. And I feel like that's a great rule to live by.
So the power of cringe.
Yeah.
That is a good taste filter, isn't it? Then what about in terms of strategy, in terms of you could, as a manager, for instance, or even as a label, you could say, right, we're going to do absolutely everything. We're going to do all the marketing. We're going to do all the distribution. We're going to run our own influencer campaigns. We're going to do it all ourselves and control it all ourselves. There must be a point where you have to sort of let go a bit and say, actually, we need to bring in someone else to do that for either bandwidth reasons or...
Yeah, I mean, we have a staff of, I think, almost 30 people, and we employ scores of independents to work on records, whether that be radio, press. We use a dedicated digital marketing agency. We use them just for the spend element rather than parameters of spend, if that makes sense. We have a whole distribution team through Virgin Universal. I think what makes us very unique is we have the core team who care desperately about what they're doing and the artist's vision and plans that we've made. But then we have a whole host of add-ons that we bring to the table as they're needed. So I wouldn't want to mislead anyone to think that, there could be upwards of 100 people working on a campaign. I mean, that just it is. I have no interest in being seen as an indie label with a ceiling. I have zero interest in that. I want to compete at the highest level and sign the brightest and the best and have really a real success. I almost said commercially successful. I stopped myself because I don't want that to be taken the wrong way, because success is, we all measure success in a very different way. I see true commercial success as building a sustainable career where every revenue stream is sort of is working and we're not relying on any one to sort of supplement the other. That's true success. And doing that on an artist's own terms is obviously like the bullseye. And I think we have achieved that a few times. But then actually, I would say that there's probably only there's probably not many managers who could even say that. I don't mean that boastfully. I mean, it's a really sort of special thing to be able to say, you know. But the important thing in what I just said is we have, you know, I want to compete with the majors. I don't want to be seen as an indie label, you know.
You've got this clearly strong drive for success, however you define it, and clearly independence is really important to you. Why? Why is that independent part really important as a sort of foundational thing?
It's autonomy, honestly. It means that no one can fuck with our shit, you know? It means that when I sit across from an artist, before they've signed to us, and that I say that we can do X, Y, and Z, like ultimately it's me who makes those decisions, not like some financial analyst who they've never met, you know? And that might sound like basic. That might sound fairly basic, but that's really important to me because I think, you know, it's often forgotten that, you know, what we're dealing with in our day-to-day lives is kind of like people's like dream. You know what I mean? I learned that pretty early in my career that, you know, not everyone who says they're making the decision is actually the one making the decision. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's really important to me, that we might not always succeed at what we do, or we might not always succeed at what we say we're going to do, but we'll certainly do what we say.
Well, in terms of then let's say there's an artist manager listening who's starting out on the journey, they've got some good artists, and they're sort of buying into your vision here of how it works. Yeah. At that stage in their career, they might still have to work with, let's say, labels or some sort of entities where there is this tension. What advice would you have for them in terms of navigating that?
I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I feel like management companies, because they have to commission deals to exist, I feel like sometimes that makes foundation for poor decision making. I made an active decision quite early on to kind of gamble, I guess, on myself. You know, what I mean by that is obviously when I started the label, initially I was cutting off like, you know, a big revenue stream for my management company, which is recording advances and royalties. Obviously, like I couldn't sign an artist to my label and then also commission the deal. That would be super weird and kind of immoral. So I would say, you know, I would try and encourage someone to look long term and point out that no one gets rich off an advance, right? People get rich from like business terms, like good business terms. So if you believe in what you're doing and the people you're working with, I would say take less upfront and make sure the back end is as tight as it can possibly be. Because ultimately, if you're right, if your choices are correct about who you're working with, that is going to be the route to sort of, you know, financial success, really. I think.
Yeah.
So my advice would be just to have kind of, you know, if you believe in an artist enough that you want to represent them, maybe you should sort of put your money where your mouth is.
And it sort of comes back down to that concept of something you need to do versus something you'd like to do, I guess.
Yeah, and also like it's the role of representation, isn't it? Being a manager, so I will always side on the side of the artist. It's just my default, and you know, even to my own cost, but that's the role. Ultimately, you know, and that sort of Dirty Hit was sort of set up with that principle in mind, which is why we only do like 50-50 deals with artists. The first couple of record deals I did, I'm pretty good at math, honestly. And the first time I looked at a record deal, like, I couldn't understand it. It made absolutely no sense, and mathematically, I mean, because it was so imbalanced. And it was only later that I actually realized that I understood it perfectly well. It's just really imbalanced.
Right. Okay.
And which was a big driver for why when I set up Dirty Hit, I wanted it to, everyone talks about, oh, we're in partnership with artists, but it never reads like a partnership. Do you know what I mean? Whereas I wanted Dirty Hit to really be founded on that principle that it is an artist partnership. Like we sort of win and lose at the same time, because it's equal. And the artist will bring, their commitment is their expression, and our commitment is to fund it and to make sure that we are protecting their vision as aggressively as we push it,
Why do you think in an era of, there's so many choices now for artists and artist management teams and labels. Okay, you can do anything. And like I say, they have the technology and the platforms and the routes to market to do everything. And that's obviously a complicated thing, but it's possible. And then there are still these, what you've just described, which let's call archaic deals, that sort of feel out of step with the possibility of the times now. And you've just described a very sort of egalitarian environment, which I'm sure artists must really enjoy. So again, this is a big question, but why do those traditional complex deals exist, do you think?
I think they're an echo from a sort of bygone era, really. I think in the past there was, you were reliant on physical distribution, so naturally, labels had kind of a stranglehold on the marketplace because, this distribution was a fucking big job, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now, like, we're talking on a distribution platform right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, so I think there's that, first of all. And I think also, like, sometimes sometimes people will take a check over terms, I think that still happens. But honestly, like, if for me, like, I'm the wrong person to ask because I haven't done a record deal of that nature in over 15 years. Because it seemed like bad business to me, and it seemed like it represented a lack of service to my client. So much so that I built my own ecosystem so that they didn't have to suffer them. You know what I mean?
Where do you see, from your perspective, with your artists that you work with, how does the role of manager, where is it going? What do they want from you, and what do you think you're going to have to give them beyond everything you've described? What sort of things are they looking for from their manager in the future?
You know what? I don't know, because I feel like I already sort of give like everything, honestly. I don't mean that as sort of, that sounded really egotistical. I didn't mean it like that. I meant it with a real humility, actually. I don't know. I mean, I sort of, obviously we've spoken about business. We've spoken about a little bit about creative. We've spoken about marketing. Like, one of the things that is also really important to me is that, I look after my artists on the sort of on the financial side of things as well. So, we work with a series of great business managers, and I inevitably become, especially with the artists that I work with on a sort of very day-to-day level, I become quite centrally involved in making sure that, like, every area is kind of taken care of. Nothing slips through the gaps, and I'm always trying to make their businesses as, like, efficient as possible, and always keeping an eye on some, like, cost.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I feel like we sort of do everything. The one thing I can't do, honestly, and has been a challenge over the years, is what I've learned is I can't really do too many things. I can't work with too many artists on a management level, because I think I give quite a lot of myself, like, emotionally to the clients I work with closely. And yeah, there's just not enough to go around otherwise, And also, I'm very lucky, I'm very, very lucky in that, I happen to personally manage, like, some people at the absolute top of their game. You know what I mean? So I feel like something would have to really, to get my attention on that level, something would have to be like really, really super special.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So on that sort of emotional and personal level, you're sharing the highs.
Yeah.
But when something doesn't work, realistically, not everything does. How does that feel for you? I feel like you're quite emotionally invested in the art and the artist.
it's really painful, honestly, because I think one always, well, I would hope one or well, let's talk about myself. I always go into these things, completely committed to making them work, achieving our goals, and sometimes that doesn't happen. It's really difficult, as I said earlier. Like you're dealing with like people's sort of hopes and dreams, aren't you? So it sort of it cuts particularly deep when you think about it like that. But again, as we established at the beginning, as I established at the beginning, like that thing that makes is that thing that is the difference between connection or lack of connection. I mean, it's such a precious thing, isn't it? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
I know how to fan it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? But I
Yeah.
don't know how
Yeah.
to forge it if it's not there. And sometimes, with all the conversation in the world, if that doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen. And that will be the question I think that people who work in music ask themselves forever is like, why is X that and why is Y that? And if we knew the answer to that, we would be very important people. You
Well, you said at the start that you've been very lucky, and then I think people say this a lot when they say, "How did you achieve this?" And they say, "Well, part of it was luck. There was hard work, there was good
yeah,
judgment, there
well,
was decision making done strategically, and then there's a little bit of luck, and all of those things are important, aren't they?"
yeah, very much so. And we work so hard, and my 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 grandfather always used to say to me like, the harder you work, the lucky. You know what I mean? And I think I'm very lucky that I have a very committed team, and some of which have been with me from pretty much the beginning. So yeah, I mean, it's I don't know. A minute ago, you asked me something, and in my head, I meant to say this, what I'm about to say, but I forgot. I feel like in life, you you got to have like purpose,
Hmm.
and I think the reason why like I really sort of seem to thrive in this environment is because it gives me a great sense of purpose. Honestly, it's aside from like, my family, it's the reason why I get up.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's like it's not like a job. It's yeah, no, it's really yeah, no. I feel very grateful. Actually.
Well, yeah,
'Cause
some
not
people
everyone
spend their
gets
whole
that,
life looking for it, that kind of purpose, don't they?
and it just sort of fell in my lap, really.
Yeah. So, as a sort of final couple of questions and quick ones,
Yeah,
you've been doing this for about 20 years, I think now, or so approximately that.
yeah.
Is there anything you know now that if you could go back to the Jamie then, starting out, and you'd say, hey, look, if there's one piece of advice I can give you, it's this. Is there anything like that has really stood out?
No, honestly, I feel like all of this stuff was sort of, or like I already sort of knew these sort of I always had these principles and sort of morals, I guess. And I always was I've always considered myself like a glass half full person
Hmm.
and pretty optimistic. And I like being busy. So I don't think there's any one thing. There's not any one. I don't know. It's difficult, man, isn't it? Because all
Yeah.
the things that happen sort of inform us as we go. And I don't, there's not really, I had a whole life before this, even, and there's nothing I would really change within that either because it all sort of led me to this place. And again, I'm very aware that I'm sounding like terribly sort of idealistic, and it must be super annoying for people who want sort of finites to hear this stuff. But
Yeah, I guess I don't think it sounds too idealistic. You're sort of talking about it comes back, I think, to that idea of that holistic purpose part, doesn't it? If you believe in what you're doing and you have that, which is a very difficult thing to do, and if you have self belief, which is also difficult, but if you have those things and you stick with them, it compounds that purpose and helps drive you forward, which is
yeah,
harder than it sounds, but
yeah,
that's also a very rare thing in the music business, isn't it? To have people who
yeah.
are doing it specifically because they really passionately believe this is the correct thing to do and seeing it through.
And also, like, to be surrounded by artists is such a gift, honestly. And like, I can't think of what. There's nothing I'd rather do, honestly. And when I witness some of the people that I work with working, I can't actually, it's like unfathomable, like how, like, truly gifted they are. Like I find it so inspiring, honestly. As someone who loves, I love music. It's what, it's what I do most of the day is listen to music while I work or whatever. But it's sort of, it's kind of, I don't know, when you're in proximity to people who are so good at what they do, like, it just is otherworldly, honestly. And I'll never not find that inspiring. Recently, when I started working with Jack, I thought I just couldn't. It's just something to witness, honestly. It's incredible.
Mm. Mm.
I will never tire of it.
Yeah, you've not lost that enthusiasm for
No,
it over that
no.
time.
If anything, it's been exaggerated by just these incredible artists who come into my life, and it can be someone who is as well known as Jack Matthew, the 1975, or it could be like, we have this new artist called Cy Gray who just blows my fucking mind. Like, honestly, like I'll get your email, I'll send you some music.
Yeah, please.
It's just, I mean, I just can't. It's like another species has made it. It's crazy. And that's ultimately, why I take the role so seriously. Because, I do see myself, like you used the word that I always use, like as this the notion of being like a facilitator or protector. I got really tired early on in my career, very early on, of like people acting like they were right 90% of the time and the artist was wrong 90% of the time.
Right.
Whereas I actually believe the artist, if you're working with a great artist, is right 90% of the time. And my job is that 10%, which is just a little bit of guidance, nurturing, sometimes pointing in the right direction, sometimes like asking questions. You know what I mean? That is my version of management, A&R, like whatever you want to call it. You know what I mean? And that is, do you know what? That's a good answer to the question you asked me. That's what I would say to a young manager is work with someone where you can stand by that statement. And if you can find that, then success will find you.
A very good way to finish this interview. Thank you, Jamie. And actually, one more question. We've talked a lot about, often these conversations are a lot about everything except music. We've talked about music throughout here, which is quite nice for a change. You were, of course, a musician. You had a career as a musician before you did all this. So this is the question I ask everybody, and they usually find it quite difficult. But I don't know if maybe you won't. But do you have a favorite piece of music that you could just listen to for the rest of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I keep going back to, no, so tough. But I always go back to Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. I never tire of that record. Or Me Is Murder by the Smiths. Like, you never. I mean, as you're already noticing, I'm sure I'm naming albums, but I'm an album person.
Yeah.
Which I think is a big part of the DNA with Dirty Hit as well. Like, we make long form content. You know what I mean? I don't know. Of course I love songs, but I love albums. I love songs within albums.
Right.
I don't know. It's too difficult to say. I couldn't. It would drive me mad if I couldn't listen to what I wanted to.
Yeah, it is. It's a difficult one. Nice to finish on something hard.
It would drive me crazy, honestly. But yeah, I think maybe if I had to choose, well, maybe I don't know, man.
Well, you can look. I think you've earned the right to pick two, so I'll let you have those two, and you can flip between those two stuck on your.
Yeah, but then I really want to take like a Bowie record as well.
Yeah. Well, look.
And I definitely need the debut Stone Roses album because I can't not listen to that again.
Right. Okay. Well, we're expanding the parameters of the question here, but I'm happy to do that. It's good to get a taste of where we're going anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll put some links to all that and to some of the musicians you're working with too beneath the podcast, and everyone can join the dots and build the picture themselves. Cool. And that's it. Enormous thanks again to Jamie. There are links below the podcast to some of the music that he chose and also an array of artists that he's working with at the moment that he's particularly excited about. So do check those out. If you found that interview interesting or useful or inspiring or any of the above, please do share the podcast on with someone who you think will find it equally so. If you want to get in touch with me, of course, I would love to hear from you. You can email me on joe@musically.com. And we have a free weekly email called The Knowledge, if you want to stay in touch that way, which rounds up bits and pieces of the best analysis, news, marketing insight, and such from across all of Music Ally's wide range of services. Sign up and become a better person immediately. Links to all that are also in the description. Right, that's it. Thank you for joining us on this episode. I've been Joe Sparrow. You have been you. And until next time, farewell.